My name is Mike, and this story began last year when my fiance and I finally bought our first starter home together. We are an Asian couple, and at our age, owning a piece of property felt like a massive milestone for our future. The house was a simple two-story build in a quiet Georgia town, exactly what we needed to start our lives. It had a decent backyard and felt safe, a typical slice of suburban paradise that we felt lucky to afford. Little did we know that this very sense of security was about to be systematically stripped away from us. The first few days were filled with the usual chaos of unpacking boxes and meeting our new neighbors. To our right lived a lovely older couple who greeted us with warm smiles almost immediately. Even the man across the street made an effort to wave and introduce himself while we were busy moving in. However, the house on our left side was a stark contrast to the rest of the friendly street. For the first several days, we didn't see a single person enter or exit that building. The curtains were always drawn tight, and although it looked well maintained, the interior seemed perpetually dark. It felt like no one lived there at all, despite the fact that a car was parked in the driveway every day. The first time we noticed something was wrong was during a mundane afternoon while carrying groceries. My fiancé whispered to me, pointing toward the front window of the dark house next door. I looked over and saw a man standing behind the curtain, partially hidden but clearly watching us. He didn't offer a wave or a friendly nod. Instead, he simply stood there like a statue. The moment he realized I had caught him staring, he abruptly stepped away into the darkness of the room. We tried to brush it off as typical social awkwardness, thinking he might just be a private person. But over the next week, the frequency of these silent observations began to escalate significantly. I would often catch him standing in his living room window whenever I left the house for work. My fiancée mentioned that she saw him peering out from an upstairs window while she was getting the mail. Every time our eyes met his, he would vanish instantly, retreating like a shadow into his house. One particular night, we experienced a moment of unease that we simply couldn't ignore. It was around midnight, and I was performing my usual routine of getting ready for bed. Out of habit, I glanced out of our bedroom window, which faced directly toward the neighbor's house. There he was, standing in his own upstairs window, but this time, he wasn't hiding at all. He stood perfectly straight, his face turned squarely toward our bedroom, as if he were expecting me. I froze in place, my heart hammering against my ribs, as I tried to process the sheer boldness of his stare. The second he realized I was looking back, he took a slow, deliberate step back into the darkness of his room. I turned to my fiancée and tried to mask my fear with a hollow laugh, calling our neighbor a creep. To our complete surprise, the man actually showed up at our front door the very next morning. This was the first time we had seen him outside his house, and he looked surprisingly normal at first glance. He knocked gently and introduced himself as Gordon, maintaining a polite and humble demeanor. Gordon apologized for looking like he was spying on us the night before, claiming it was all a misunderstanding. He explained that he had simply been placing something on his window ledge and didn't mean to peer into our room. His constant smile provided a bit of relief, making me feel like perhaps we had overreacted to his behavior. Even so, there was still something slightly off about him that I couldn't quite put my finger on. I didn't want to start our relationship with the neighbors on a bad note, so I accepted his apology graciously. When I went back inside, I told my fiancée that while he seemed nice, he definitely had a weird energy about him. We ultimately decided to try and forget the whole incident and focus on making our new house a home. However, our attempt at a normal life was shattered just a week later by a sound that woke us in the dead of night. My fiancée shook me awake, her voice a frantic whisper as she claimed someone was moving around in our backyard. I struggled to shake off my sleep as I crept toward the window to see if she was right. When I finally looked outside, my blood ran cold at the sight of a figure stalking through our private yard. This was no animal. It was clearly a full-grown man, and he was searching for something in the dark. Without thinking of the potential consequences, I threw open the window and shouted at the intruder to get out. The figure didn't hesitate for a second, bolting toward the gate and slamming it shut with a resounding crack. I watched from the front window, but the street was empty, and the silence that followed was even more deafening. We lay awake for hours, the realization sinking in that our private sanctuary was being invaded from the shadows. Little did I know, this was only the beginning of a nightmare that would involve far more than just watching from the windows. The following week was filled with a thick, suffocating silence that seemed to hang over the entire neighborhood. Every time I stepped out to get the mail, I could feel a pair of eyes burning into the back of my neck. Gordon's house remained a fortress of stillness, save for the occasional twitch of those heavy, yellowed curtains. My fiancée tried to convince me that I was just being overly sensitive to the eccentricities of an old man. But the feeling of being hunted in my own home was something I couldn't simply shake off. It happened on a Tuesday night around 2 in the morning while the rest of the world was asleep. A faint metallic scraping sound echoed from the backyard, jolting me out of a light sleep. I laid there frozen for a moment, listening to the rhythm of my own pounding heart. There it was again, the sound of something heavy dragging across the grass behind the fence. I carefully slid out of bed, making sure not to wake my fiancée as I moved toward the window. I peeled back the edge of the blind just enough to peer into the moonlit yard. My breath hitched in my throat when I saw a dark silhouette standing perfectly still near our tool shed. The figure was wearing a heavy coat that looked far too warm for a Georgia summer night. It was Gordon, and he was simply staring at our back door with an intensity that felt predatory. A surge of adrenaline and protective rage replaced my initial fear. I grabbed a heavy flashlight from the nightstand and headed for the back door. I didn't turn on any interior lights, wanting to maintain whatever advantage I had left. The floorboards creaked beneath my feet, sounding like gunshots in the dead of night. I reached the sliding glass door and placed my hand on the cold handle. I threw the door open and stepped out into the night air, clicking the flashlight on instantly. The beam hit Gordon directly in the face, causing him to squint but not move an inch. "What the hell are you doing in my yard, Gordon?" I shouted, my voice cracking slightly. He didn't answer immediately, just stood there bathing in the light like a statue. I noticed he was holding a small rusted hand trowel in his right hand. "I'm calling the police right now if you don't leave," I threatened, taking a step forward. Finally, a slow, crooked smile spread across his weathered face. "You people are always so loud," he rasped, his voice sounding like sandpaper on wood. "What are you talking about? It's 2 in the morning, we're sleeping," I retorted. He took a slow, deliberate step toward me, and I reflexively tightened my grip on the flashlight. "I was just checking the perimeter, making sure things stay the way they're supposed to be," he said cryptically. He spat on the ground, a gesture of pure, unadulterated disrespect. "Get out, now. I won't tell you again," I said, trying to keep my voice from trembling. Gordon chuckled, a low, wet sound that made the hair on my arms stand up. Without another word, he turned his back on me and began walking toward the gate in the fence. He moved with a strange, limping gait that I hadn't noticed before. I watched him exit through the gate and heard the latch click shut with a finality that felt like a warning. I stood in the yard for several minutes, scanning the darkness to ensure he was truly gone. When I finally went back inside and locked the door, I realized I was shaking violently. I checked the front window, and there he was, standing in his own dark living room, watching me through the gap in his curtains. I knew right then that a simple trespassing incident was just the tip of the iceberg with this man. My phone buzzed on the counter, a notification from my security camera that I had just installed. I opened the app to see a recording from 10 minutes ago, showing Gordon pressing his face against our bedroom window while we slept. He wasn't just checking the yard, he was watching us in our most vulnerable moments. Tomorrow, I would have to take more drastic measures to protect my family. But as I looked back at the live feed, I saw that Gordon was no longer at his window, and my front porch light suddenly flickered and went out. The next day, Gordon appeared at our door again with a strangely calm expression. He invited us over for Chinese food the following Friday night as a peace offering. We felt that saying yes might finally bridge the gap and end the weirdness between us. When Friday evening arrived, the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a chill over the street. We walked a short distance to Gordon's house at exactly 7 o'clock. The moment we stepped inside, the air in his living room felt thick and suffocating. Gordon already smelled strongly of alcohol and held a glass of dark wine in his hand. He let out a sharp, mocking laugh while gesturing toward the empty dining table. He mentioned he ordered plenty of food because he knew you guys love Chinese food. The delivery driver arrived shortly after, and we offered to help set the table. Gordon suddenly snapped at us, shouting that he didn't need our help in his own kitchen. We sat in a deafening silence as he aggressively unpacked the plastic containers. With every sip of wine, his passive-aggressive comments became more direct and venomous. He began talking about how the neighborhood used to have a certain history before we arrived. He explicitly stated that this town was meant to stay white and that we didn't belong. Then, he leaned in and admitted that he was the one prowling through our yard at night. He shouted that we were not welcome and that the neighborhood wasn't for people like us. Without a word, we stood up and bolted for the front door as fast as we could. We didn't stop until we were inside our own house, with the deadbolt turned. The following days were spent in a state of constant, paralyzing paranoia. We spoke to other neighbors, who revealed that Gordon was a local alcoholic with a bitter past. Despite the warnings, we were trapped living right next to a man who despised our existence. Every single night, we felt the weight of his gaze coming from that dark house next door. One night, a violent crashing sound erupted from our downstairs living room. We found a heavy brick lying amidst a sea of shattered glass on our carpet. My heart hammered against my ribs as I looked out through the jagged hole in the window. The police arrived later, but they told us there was nothing they could do without proof. Gordon simply lied to them, acting like a confused and innocent old man. The mental strain of being hunted in our own home became too much to bear. Less than 2 months after moving in, we began packing our lives into cardboard boxes. We were abandoning the starter home we had worked so hard to finally buy. We moved out as fast as we could, never looking back at the house on our left. Even now, the memory of Gordon's hateful smile follows me in my sleep. We escaped with our lives, but the trauma of that neighborhood stays with us. I often think that if we had stayed, we would have ended up as a tragic headline. All we can do now is move forward and try to forget those shadows next door. But as we settled into our new life, a new story of neighborly terror was already beginning elsewhere. A different couple, Noah and Gabby, were about to meet their own version of the perfect neighbor. They had no idea that the friendly faces next door were hiding a secret far more violent than Gordon's hate. Just as Noah reached for the cake, he heard a muffled, desperate thud coming from beneath his neighbor's floorboards. It was late 2021 when Noah and his fiancée Gabby finally moved into their dream home in a quiet suburban neighborhood. The two-story house felt like the perfect foundation for the future family they were planning to build together. As they unpacked their belongings, they noticed the surrounding neighbors seemed exceptionally friendly and welcoming. The couple living in the house directly to their right appeared to be the most approachable of the bunch. Daniel and Veronica were a couple in their late 30s who radiated a sense of suburban normalcy. Just a few days after the move, the doorbell rang, revealing Veronica holding a beautifully crafted red velvet cake. Noah joined them at the door, thanking the neighbors profusely for such a thoughtful and delicious welcoming gift. That night, Noah and Gabby sat in their new kitchen, enjoying the rich, sweet flavors of the homemade cake. The first 2 weeks in the new neighborhood were exactly what they had hoped for, quiet and serene. However, the peaceful atmosphere was suddenly shattered one Tuesday night around 11 o'clock. Noah heard muffled but aggressive shouting echoing through the walls of the neighboring house. He moved to the bedroom window, trying to discern where the heated exchange was coming from. Because of the angle between the two buildings, he couldn't see the individuals, only the glow of their interior lights. The shouting grew louder, punctuated by the sound of something heavy being thrown or falling. Minutes later, Veronica stormed out of her front door, clutching her car keys and looking visibly distraught. She started the engine and sped away into the night, leaving a heavy silence behind her. Noah eventually told Gabby about the incident, but they both decided it was just a typical domestic disagreement. Still, a seed of worry was planted, as Daniel and Veronica had seemed far too sweet for such volatility. Later that same week, as the couple returned home from work, the yelling erupted once more. The neighbor's main door was open, and only the storm door stood between the outside world and their private rage. Noah and Gabby hurried inside their own home, feeling like they were intruding on something dark and personal. In the days that followed, Noah noticed that Veronica's car had not returned to its usual spot. He assumed she might have gone on a short vacation to clear her head after the arguments. Daniel was still around, as his car remained parked in the driveway, though he was rarely seen outside. 1 week turned into 2, and there was still no sign of Veronica or her vehicle. Gabby began to speculate that the couple might have filed for divorce, given the intensity of their fights. However, the suddenness of her departure and the continued absence felt increasingly abnormal. Daniel's behavior had also shifted dramatically. He now actively avoided any eye contact with Noah. On the rare occasions they crossed paths, Daniel spoke with a frantic, nervous energy that was impossible to ignore. After 3 full weeks of silence from Veronica, Noah decided he could no longer stay quiet. Gabby pleaded with him to stay out of it, fearing he was overstepping their bounds as new neighbors. Noah, driven by a gut feeling he couldn't shake, ignored her warnings and walked over to Daniel's porch. He pressed the doorbell and waited, listening to the heavy silence emanating from within the house. It took nearly 3 minutes before the door finally creaked open, revealing a disheveled Daniel. Daniel was drenched in sweat and wore a forced, haunting smile that didn't reach his frantic eyes. Noah asked directly about Veronica's whereabouts, noting that her car had been missing for weeks. Daniel hesitated, stumbling over his words, as he claimed she was out of state caring for her sick mother. Noah questioned why he was so out of breath, to which Daniel claimed he had been working out upstairs. Suddenly, a high-pitched, desperate scream for help tore through the air from somewhere deep within the house. Just as Noah reached for his phone, he heard a muffled, desperate thud coming from beneath his neighbor's floorboards. The silence from the house next door became more oppressive with every passing hour. I stood by my bedroom window, staring at the spot where Veronica's car used to be parked. It had been 2 full weeks since the last time any of us had seen her face. Gabby sat on the edge of the bed, her face etched with a worry she couldn't hide. We discussed the possibility of a divorce, yet the suddenness of her departure felt wrong. Daniel's behavior had shifted from overly friendly to strangely reclusive and avoidant. Whenever I tried to catch his eye for a neighborly wave, he would pivot away instantly. By the 3rd week of her absence, the knot in my stomach told me I couldn't stay silent. Gabby begged me to mind our own business, fearing I might provoke an unnecessary conflict. I stepped out onto the porch anyway, the cool air biting at my skin as I crossed the lawn. My heart hammered against my ribs as I reached out to press Daniel's doorbell. The chime echoed deeply inside the house, but for a long time, there was no movement. I checked my watch, noticing that nearly 3 minutes had passed in total silence. Suddenly, the locks clicked and the heavy door groaned open just a few inches. Daniel stood there, looking like a man who had been dragged through a nightmare. He was drenched in sweat, his t-shirt clinging to his chest as if he'd just finished a marathon. I asked him directly where Veronica was, trying to keep my voice steady and calm. He stammered, claiming she had gone out of state to care for her sick mother. His eyes darted around the yard, never once meeting my gaze for more than a second. When I questioned his frantic state, he claimed he was simply performing a heavy workout upstairs. Just as I prepared to leave, a blood-curdling scream pierced the air from deep within the house. It was a woman's voice, raw and desperate, begging for someone to help her. Daniel's face went pale, and he quickly dismissed it as a movie he had forgotten to pause. I backed away slowly, my mind racing with the realization that he was lying to my face. The moment I crossed the threshold of my own home, I grabbed my phone with shaking hands. Gabby watched me dial 911, her own realization of the horror next door finally setting in. I whispered the details to the dispatcher, begging them to send someone for a welfare check immediately. 10 minutes felt like an eternity as we waited behind our locked front door. The sudden wail of sirens shattered the suburban quiet, and blue and red lights began to dance on our walls. 5 police cruisers skidded to a halt, officers spilling out with their weapons drawn. We watched from our lawn as they kicked in Daniel's front door with a thunderous crash. A few minutes later, Veronica was wheeled out on a stretcher, her body covered in blood-soaked bandages. Daniel followed shortly after, his hands bound in steel cuffs as he was marched toward a patrol car. As he passed us, he leaned toward me and hissed a promise of revenge that I would never forget. We later learned the full extent of the horror. She had been kept captive in the basement for weeks. Veronica didn't survive the night, succumbing to the injuries she sustained during his final violent outburst. Even with Daniel behind bars, the silence of the empty house next door felt like a threat. A few nights later, I woke up in a cold sweat, convinced I saw his silhouette in our bedroom. His dream self lunged at me with a knife, his voice echoing the same threats from that night. Though we eventually moved away, the knowledge that we lived inches from a monster still haunts my every thought. But as I tried to put the past behind me, a new neighbor was moving into the duplex across town, unaware of the sound soon to come. My name is Devin, and I was 24 when I moved into what I thought would be my dream duplex in Queens. The house was an old, weathered structure literally split down the middle into 2 separate living spaces. I occupied the left side while a mysterious tenant lived on the right, whom the landlord said worked late nights. For the first week, my life was a simple routine of long work shifts and crashing into bed the moment I got home. I quickly realized that the wall separating our bedrooms on the second floor was incredibly thin. In the silence of the night, I could hear the faint, muffled sounds of shifting furniture or footsteps from the other side. One Tuesday night, while scrolling through my phone, a strange sound broke the quiet of my room. It was a man's voice, but it was twisted into a bizarre, high-pitched mumble that didn't sound natural. The tone was so artificial, like someone intentionally straining their vocal cords to sound like a child or a puppet. I couldn't make out any specific words, just a rhythmic, high-pitched babbling that went on for minutes. I told myself he was probably just watching a weird movie, or maybe he was an eccentric actor practicing a role. The mumbling eventually tapered off into a low drone before silence finally returned to the duplex. However, a few nights later, the sound returned, and this time it was undeniably more aggressive. I leaned closer and pressed my ear against the cold plaster to confirm what I was hearing. He wasn't on the phone, he was talking to himself in that same freakish, high-pitched register. The realization that I was living alone next to someone so unstable made my stomach churn with dread. I buried my head under the covers, trying to disappear into the mattress and escape the sound of his voice. Then, after 2 weeks of the mumbling, a new sound began, a rhythmic, deliberate tapping on the wall. 2 sharp taps landed right next to where my head rested on the pillow, vibrating through the headboard. I froze, my heart hammering against my ribs as I waited in the suffocating silence for another sound. Exactly 10 seconds later, 2 more identical taps echoed through the room, perfectly timed and purposeful. I rolled off the bed and scrambled to the center of the room, my body shaking with uncontrollable tremors. I wanted to scream or bang back, but a primal instinct told me that acknowledging him would only invite him in. The tapping continued intermittently throughout the week, always occurring just as I was drifting into sleep. I began to imagine him standing just inches away on the other side, his hand poised against the drywall, waiting for me. I resorted to wearing heavy noise-canceling headphones and blasting white noise just to get a few hours of rest. But even with the sound blocked, I could still feel the vibrations of the harder thuds through the floorboards. I started staying up late with all the lights on, too afraid to close my eyes in the dark. Then came the night that shattered my remaining sense of security completely. 3 slow, heavy knocks vibrated through the wall, followed by a silence so heavy it felt physical. That same high-pitched, mocking voice whispered a question that made my blood turn to ice. "What are you doing in there?" the voice asked, the words sounding crisp and terrifyingly close. I bolted upright, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps as I realized he was talking directly to me. He knew I was there, he knew I was listening, and he was watching my every move through the thin barrier. I grabbed my phone with shaking hands and dialed my boyfriend, my voice barely a whisper as I begged him to come over. I sat with my back against the bedroom door, clutching a heavy lamp as a makeshift weapon until I heard his car pull up. Having him there provided a temporary reprieve, but the silence from the other side of the wall felt like a trap. For the next few days, the neighbor was uncharacteristically quiet, which only served to heighten my paranoia. I couldn't shake the feeling that he was just biding his time, waiting for me to be alone once again. One evening, while my boyfriend was at work, I was startled awake by a rapid, frantic drumming of fingers against the bedroom wall. I lost my temper and screamed at the wall for him to leave me alone, my voice cracking with desperation. But the response didn't come from behind the wall. It came from the dark corner of my own room. A deep, guttural voice from the shadows commanded me to go to sleep, and I realized he wasn't next door anymore. That deep, guttural command to go to sleep vibrated through the air of my own bedroom, not the wall. I launched off my bed as if the mattress itself had turned into fire. My legs moved before my brain could even process the direction of the exit. The hallway felt like a miles-long tunnel of suffocating darkness. I flew down the stairs, nearly tripping over my own bare feet in the rush. Every shadow at the bottom of the steps looked like a person waiting to grab me. I fumbled with the deadbolt, my fingers slick with cold sweat. The door finally swung open, and I burst out into the freezing New York night. I didn't stop until I reached the middle of the asphalt, screaming for anyone to hear me. I kept spinning around, fully expecting to see my neighbor standing on the porch behind me. A man from a few houses down finally opened his door, looking at me with total confusion. I begged him to call the police, my voice cracking with every sob. The wait for the sirens felt like an eternity while I shivered on the sidewalk. When the flashing blue and red lights finally appeared, I felt a momentary surge of safety. I told the officers about the voice inside my room and the months of tapping. They entered my side of the duplex with their flashlights drawn and voices low. They searched every closet and even looked under my bed, but they found absolutely no one. There were no signs of forced entry, and my front door had been wide open. The officers knocked on the neighbor's side of the house repeatedly, but there was no answer. The neighbor's windows remained pitch black, as if the house were completely empty. I couldn't even bring myself to go back inside to grab my shoes. My boyfriend arrived shortly after and practically carried me into his car. That very morning, I called my landlord and told him I was never coming back. He tried to talk about the lease, but I told him my life was worth more than a piece of paper. I only returned to the duplex with my boyfriend and several friends to pack my things. Every time we were there, I stared at the neighbor's door, waiting for it to open. His car remained in the driveway, but we never saw a single sign of life inside. I noticed a small package had been delivered to his door and sat there for days. I moved back in with my parents, feeling like I had failed at my first attempt at independence. Months later, my landlord mentioned that the neighbor had also moved out without a word. He left most of his furniture behind, as if he had simply vanished into thin air. I still wonder if there was a hidden passage between our rooms that the police missed. Sometimes I dream that I'm back in that bed and I hear the drumming fingers again. The trauma of that night changed the way I look at every building I enter. We like to think of our homes as fortresses, but they are often just thin shells. You never truly know who is on the other side of the wall watching and listening. Mike, Noah, and I all learned that some neighbors bring more than just a welcome mat. They bring their secrets, their malice, and their darkness right into your life. I am safe now, far away from that duplex and the man who lived there. But every time I hear a knock on a wall, my heart still skips a beat. Be careful who you live next to, because you might not be the only one in your room.